Honourable Minister Roderick Caldes, Excellencies, Chairs, Keynote Speakers, Moderators, Panelists, Participants, colleagues and friends. The Ministry for Social Accommodation in Malta is honoured to be hosting today's workshop towards sustainable homes and neighbourhoods in the Mediterranean region, reflecting on Malta's potential. This workshop is being organised in cooperation with United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE, Housing Europe, UN Habitat, and Union for the Mediterranean within the initiative Housing 2030, Improving Housing Affordability in the UNECE region. I especially wish to thank the organising team from the United Nations, Ms. Kulnara Roll, Secretary to the Committee on Housing and Land Management, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, who has made today's workshop possible. Together with Ms. Victoria Jimenez, Head of Sector, Transport and Urban Development, Ms. Dara Turnbull, Research Coordinator at Housing Europe, and thank you, Ms. Julie Lawson, Lead Author of the Housing 2030 Initiative Report and Centre for Urban Research, RMIT University. It has been a true pleasure collaborating with you all, and thank you so much for making today's workshop possible. Malta, like other Euro-American societies, has experienced drastic demographic, political and economic transformations due to the pull of progress brought about by an economic boom. Such changes, which are largely experienced at household level, cannot be ignored by the state. Hence, the Ministry for Social Accommodation sought to address these, developing and implementing its first ever national housing system. The Ministry has made clear that it is putting the home at the centre of Maltese society, a vision which is rethinking and re-evaluating contemporary housing from a holistic perspective. The system is taking a people-centred approach to housing as it invests in adequate housing in order to ensure security, belonging, prosperity and well-being in Malta. Today you have a list of distinguished speakers who will be talking about issues related to affordability in a broad sense. Our first speaker is our very own Minister, Honourable Caldes, who will be introducing the main concepts behind the development of Malta's national housing system.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. First, I would like to start by thanking you all for being here today. I want to especially thank the United Nations coordinating team and the policy team at the Ministry for Social Accommodation. Their hard work made this exciting workshop possible despite the pandemic. I heard that they met religiously on a weekly basis. As the Minister for Social Accommodation, I see this collaborative workshop as a unique opportunity for Malta. The timing is perfect as we find ourselves at the initial stages of developing a national housing system for the first time. At this point, we may have more questions than answers as we carefully move from the design and research phase towards implementation. This is the most delicate part, as it is here that we have to manage relations across various sectors. What I am certain of is that housing must be placed at the center of our society. This vision is rethinking and re-evaluating contemporary housing from a holistic perspective. Investing in adequate housing is one way of ensuring security, belonging, prosperity, and well-being in Malta. Our way so far has been to put the social dimensions of housing at the core of the theory and research. We started by asking simple questions such as, what is a home? Are we all under the same roof? I am fully aware that not every family or individual has access to a decent roof over their head. Let's think about it for a moment. Our homes are at the core of our livelihoods. Without a home, we cannot fully participate as active citizens, as without an address, we cannot be taxed, we cannot vote, and we may also be excluded from population statistics. So by putting homes, people, and their experiences first, it becomes possible to include the multiple voices of a now multi-ethnic and diverse Malta. To me, it is important to acknowledge these alternative domestic experiences. It is through such an understanding that we can truly design a system that attends to diverse needs, wants, and desires of society. It is only by taking this perspective that housing will be truly put at the center of our society. This vision for the future requires a system-based approach to housing with a renewed focus. It should consider the significance of an integrative approach to our homes by bringing together culture, law, rights, economy, and environment. Therefore, an underlying question that this housing system proposes is, how should we envision, plan, and manage housing? This is not an easy task. In fact, I empathize with policymakers, architects, engineers, and urban planners alike, as housing a diverse population whose needs and realities are ever-changing is difficult. Households tend to change over time and adapt in creative and sometimes unpredictable ways, especially when striving to meet the demands of market forces. Changing households require a housing system that takes a broad contextual and longitudinal approach. This is important because this way we can understand how the household is impacted by social, economic, health, and urban transformation. In order to achieve this in practical terms, my ministry has embarked on a national and a collective exercise with scholars, citizens, including private organizations and government entities. In the process of rethinking and doing housing differently, my team of experts identified 4 pillars: people, connectedness, sustainability, and digitization. These are interlinked pillars which will guide our thinking in the process of consultation, planning, and managing this long-term vision. Why did we choose these 4 specific pillars? Homes are at the center of everything, because people are. Therefore, our future homes must support and serve society. Homes have the potential to tangibly bring together structure, form, community, heritage, urban planning, and housing policies. They are connectors. A system-based strategy sees housing as an organic part of the entire infrastructural network. It will become increasingly difficult to sustain our homes unless the system itself becomes sustainable, green, and realistic. Our homes need to be able to stand the test of time while being able to attend the needs and abilities of all. This sustainable intervention will deliberately move towards the circular economy in housing and infrastructure. Incorporating digital assets is an effective management tool for the housing system of the future. Being digitally connected at home has become a contemporary need as more people shift to telework, whether it's due to childcare, illness, or a pandemic. I am adamant that the development of our first national housing system could be perceived as an opportunity, whereby the planning and design of the local housing market could benefit from a culturally sensitive approach. This is also ideal as we can borrow ideas and practices from other systems while remaining true to our own cultural needs. Additionally, through our strategic narrative, we can facilitate a mental shift from seeing housing as a commodity to housing as a social and human right. These factors should be inherent characteristics in policymaking and legislation. Finally, I hope to mobilize a mental shift which recognizes the strength of developing a systems-based approach to our future homes, one which moves away from silos in policy, development, and decision-making. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Honourable Caldas. Your Excellency, Ms. Aisha Isa, Deputy Secretary General for Transport and Urban Development, Union for the Mediterranean, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, the trust inclusion, the Union for the Mediterranean. For those parties, it's evident there is a lot. Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you now.
The Union for the Mediterranean is a regional organization which has EU member states and the rest of the Mediterranean littoral states, Jordan, as well as Mauritania. So, in this organization, what we have been trying to do for the past 1.5 years is to develop a strategic action plan for urban development for the next 2 decades. And this effort is being led by an academic team from the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And UNESCO contributes to this process as well. So under this strategic plan, the University of Delft team has identified, together with the UFM member states, a number of themes which are called as the axis of intervention. The first axis of intervention is the housing sector. So we have also developed an action plan for housing. And this action plan is very important in the sense that it is a science-led project. It has been, written by scientists. So in interaction with all the member states, plus they have taken account of all of the major policy frameworks in the world. So from the UN to the EU, including new Leipzig Charter, all of these have been taken into account in the preparation of this action plan. This action plan is under discussion, and we hope to finalize it by the end of the year. If any of the participants who are not aware of this process is interested, they should just get in touch with Victoria Jimenez, who is our head of sector, and we will be more than willing to share these documents with you. Let me just say a few words about the climate change. Climate change is very important in the region. The UFM is going to launch, together with its partners, the first scientific report on climate change in the Mediterranean region. The preliminary results, or the preliminary findings of this report, indicate that the Mediterranean region is already living the climate change. So the temperature is already more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, more than the pre-industrial level. And this temperature increase will probably reach to 2.2 degrees centigrade by 2040. So we are in an emergency situation. That is why this climate emergency or climate-proof urban planning, including housing, is the first priority in this part of the world for us. It's very, very important. And we have seen during the epidemic that houses need to be shelters as well. They need to be designed as shelters. It's very important. But during the Lebanese blast of 4th August, we have also seen that it is very important to climate-proof as well, or the make disaster-proof the houses that have historic value. So, for climate change, we need to climate-proof our houses first, but there should be a priority given also to the houses with historic value because they are part of our Mediterranean identity and Mediterranean heritage. This is all I want to say at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Ms. Doris Andoni, Chair, UNECE Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management, I kindly ask you to take the floor.
For my brief intervention, I am very honored to give this speech on behalf of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management. It is the workshop subject towards sustainable homes and neighborhoods in the Mediterranean region, reflecting on Malta's potentials, is of utmost, but let me ask you, is the audio okay? Because sometimes I have problems.
We can hear you, it's fine.
Okay, thank you. Is of utmost relevance, especially in these difficult times when COVID-19 pandemic has forced states to take drastic measures that have affected particularly poor and vulnerable groups. UNECE is one of the 5 United Nations commissions and includes 56 member states that are extended from the Northern Americas to Europe and Central Asia. Our committee, which is the Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management, brings together senior government officials from its 56 member states, and the committee is an intergovernmental body which addresses the housing and urban development challenges of the UNECE region, and one of the oldest, established in 1947 as a response to the housing crisis of post-Second World War, with a mission to reconstruct the housing stock and cities in Europe. In face of the sustainability challenges of today's, its role is as important as it was 73 years ago, but with a revised mission to serve as an important platform for facilitating an exchange of practices and experiences to overcome multiple challenges our countries and cities face. Our committee works for achieving sustainability in cities and communities through improving access to adequate and affordable housing. And in this sense, SDG 11 is the core of our work. But through our work, we also contribute to poverty reduction, to improved health and well-being, achieving gender equality, enhancing affordable and clean energy in the housing sector, supporting the circular economy, and by improving living conditions, we also contribute to peace, justice, and stronger institutions. We achieve these goals through partnering with a great number of organizations and institutions, NGOs, academia, private sector, etc. Therefore, although committees primarily, you can see in this slide that the number of SDGs that we contribute in achieving. But to create an idea on the magnitude of the challenges that our region is facing, at the same time the importance of the committee's role in this regard, I bring you some figures about the region. In our region, 73% of the population live in urban areas, so is a highly urbanized area. Some 40% of CO2 emissions in our region are produced by buildings, which show for a great potential also for energy savings, but also for cleaner, taking measures and policies for reducing emissions. And this also explains our focus in also in this component. Some 100 million people in the ECE region spend more than 40% of their disposable income on housing, which show for big problem with affordability of housing, and also related with the theme and subject that will be also presented by the speakers later on. And some 10 million people at least are waiting for social housing in ECE region. And that's why I got very much intrigued by the fact that Malta has a ministry for social accommodation and developing a policy and strategy in this regard. The work of the committee is based on key United Nations policy documents on housing and urban development, including the Geneva UN Charter on Sustainable Housing. This charter was endorsed in 2015 by United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. The charter is the expression of political will of the 56 member states to ensure a high quality of life to their citizens through the provision of adequate, safe, healthy housing and sustainable cities. Charter supports implementation of 2030 agenda. According to the Geneva UN Charter on Sustainable Housing, national policies and planning should promote integrated policies and plans to support inclusion, including socially mixed communities, resource efficiency and resilience to climate change and disasters. The Charter sees housing as a central component of quality of life and as foundation of good health and social cohesion, which goes in line of what Minister mentioned in his speech. The Charter is based on 4 principles of environmental protection, economic effectiveness, social inclusion and participation, cultural adequacy. To facilitate and support the implementation of the Charter, Geneva UN Charter Center of Excellence are established in different countries, and these Center of Excellences provide exchange of best practices, research, support, and or training, policy advice, etc. For more information on the Charter, you can visit the address that is shown in this slide. Challenge is that the committee will have its 81st session in Geneva from 5 to 9 October in a hybrid format. It will start with on 5th of October with SDG 11 Day. It will continue with the Forum of Mayors, and then we will have 2 days of committee session, and will be concluded with on 9 October with United for Smart Sustainable Cities annual meeting. You are invited, and I take this opportunity to invite you to register and to participate in our committee session that will be held soon next October. And to participate, you can follow also this link. Challenges that cities are facing nowadays cannot be solved by national governments alone, while the achievement of SDGs cannot be reached if local governments are not involved. And that's why last year the committee decided to hold for the first time a forum of mayors back-to-back to a committee session. The Forum of Mayors will provide a platform for local governments to discuss how cities can better adapt, prepare and respond to emergencies, including the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as local responses to the effects of climate change and disasters. There are, every day it is updated, this information. Until now, we have 41 mayors out of 56 member states confirmed their participation. The Forum of Mayor will be moderated by Mayor of Geneva, Mr. Sami Kanan, with a keynote speech from Mayor of Milan, Giuseppe Sala, and opening speeches from Ms. Olga Algayerova, the Executive Secretary of UNECE, and Tatiana Valovaya, Director General of United Nations at Geneva. So you are also invited to register and to participate in this Forum of Mayors. And this is what I wanted to share with you. I thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'm available for any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Andoni. And now we are honored to be joined today by the President of Housing Europe, His Excellency, Mr. Bent Madsen. Your Excellency, I kindly ask for your intervention.
Thank you very much. I would like today to begin to take a moment to thank everyone who has made this event possible, and of whom I am reliably informed that too many, far too many, to say an individual thank you. But I hope, as has been the case, often as the saying goes, many hands make light work. Having only recently been elected as President of Housing Europe, I'm delighted that my first public event in this new role is with such a fine selection of speakers and attendees, and I'm of course particularly happy with the attendance of those of the Maltese and other national ministries responsible for housing. If I were to offer you one word of advice, it is that while it can be difficult to start down the path providing an adequate supply of social housing, not making the effort on behalf of your fellow citizens, it's actually even more difficult. That everyone should have a safe, secure, and affordable roof over their heads at night should be an ambition for any country to pursue. And I'm very happy with the initiative of the Maltese Ministry in calling for this conference today to explore how that goal can be achieved. As you know, today's event is a part of Housing 2030 initiative, which we at Housing Europe are so happy to share with our partners at the UNECE and UN Habitat. At its core, Housing 2030 is a quest for knowledge and inspiration. The knowledge of what policies exist to tackle housing affordability issues, and the inspiration to pursue them, following the path that has been worn by successful projects in other countries. Public, cooperative, and social housing providers in Europe have been and will continue to be valuable sources of both knowledge and inspiration. Housing Europe's members provide over 27 million homes right across Europe. Many of our members have over 100 years of experience in providing housing for those who need it, and we know how it's done, and we know the benefit that it provides, not just for tenants, but for the society as a whole. I have the benefit of coming from Denmark, a country in which over 20% of the housing units are social. And it has not always been easy to arrive at this current situation. But we have for decades now benefited from a broad political consensus that housing is an essential part of a well-functioning, compassionate, and dynamic society. Social housing represented less than 10% of the Danish housing stock back in the early 60s. So progress can be made, lives can be improved, and societies can be sustained, but only if the policies are right. A strong foundation is essential for success, and I know that Housing 2030 aims to play an important role in this regard. So let us share our knowledge and our experience with each other. Let us have the important conversations that need to be had. And when it comes to delivering social and affordable housing, let us go forward and do it. Thank you for your time, and I wish you all a wonderful and an informative conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you for your intervention. We will be closing the first part of this session through an intervention by Mr. Christophe Lalande, Leader, Housing Unit from UN Habitats.
Good morning, thank you very much, and I'm very thankful for your invitation and for all the work that you put to organize this event. I mean, it's true that it has been like many weeks of discussions and meetings. So first of all, I mean, I really would like to acknowledge the presence of His Excellency, Minister Galdes, to open this event, but also like to really, on behalf of the UN Habitat, we are very privileged and we are very pleased with your support on the government of Malta and all the stakeholders in Malta to organize this event and this initiative. I also am particularly grateful to the Economic Commission for Europe, to UNECE, to our colleagues, to Housing Europe, but also like to the Union for the Mediterranean. So for us, it's a very important event to really push this very crucial question of the affordability of the housing stock on the agenda. So of course, this is like a European agenda, but this is also from our perspective as a global stakeholder, helping us really to better understand these very important challenges on how to better provide access to adequate housing for the most vulnerable globally in all regions. So we are really like looking forward to like these discussions and to see how we can like build more efforts on that. What I wanted to highlight is that really housing, and this is something that we are perceiving even more now in the current situation we are living, is at the cornerstone of many dimensions of human life. And I really welcome the introduction from Minister Galdes, because this is really what we believe. Housing is at the center of this very many social and economic dimension for the well-being of the people. And I think that we can see like the interconnection with health, but also like to employment opportunity, access to jobs, and overall well-being of people. And this is fully in line with like some of the principles that we are pushing at UN Habitat when we are providing technical support to member states, but also like to local leaders to implement and design housing policies and programs. First of all, one of these key principles is really like about providing well-located housing. Housing needs to be not only at the center, the physical center of cities, but at the center of like urban services and opportunities for people. We also want, as a second principle, to promote a variety of tenure that goes like beyond the home ownership. There is a variety of tenure. We really need to address the needs also like of the most vulnerable when conceptualizing this offer for the housing stock. Finally, and this is very important, and this is where this initiative is really contributing to, is to strengthen the evidence-based knowledge for like promoting the right to adequate housing for all. So we believe that this initiative Housing 2030 is fully contributing to this work and to these key principles, and we are very pleased to be part of this joint work. We look forward to really, through this initiative, to continue strengthening the collaboration between all stakeholders globally. I think that this is perhaps one of the first steps for a global call for having like a more coordinated approach to bringing solutions for the most vulnerable to achieve the right to adequate housing for all in Europe and beyond. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Christophe Lalande, Leader, Housing Unit, UN Habitat. Thank you all for following us on Facebook Live. We will now be proceeding to continuing the conference online on Zoom. Thank you for joining us on Facebook. We are now going to move on to setting Order of the Housing 2030 and Honorary Professor Center for Urban Research, RMIT University Initiative Report and Center for Urban Research, together with Ms. Elena Solgayava, Housing 2030 Initiative Co-Chair.
Thank you. I think there is going to be a slide presentation to be displayed on the screen.
Yes, we can see the presentation now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I am very pleased indeed to have been invited to be co-chair of the Housing 2030 project and honoured to have been invited to come and speak at this important conference today. The previous speakers have already very clearly and very strongly made the case for housing. Those of us who have been involved in housing for many years have always believed that all of us are better able to manage our lives if we have a secure, affordable home to start, to be able to grow as people and to be able to engage with the world in a constructive, positive way. All of that is made much easier if you have a good quality home that you can properly afford. So the background to this initiative is that all over the world, countries are concluding that they need to do more about housing. We already knew this was the case, but the COVID pandemic has brought it even more sharply into focus, and many governments, Malta amongst others, are looking very clearly now at how best to improve the quality of homes for people in their nation. And what we want to be able to do is to help people not to have to start completely from scratch, but to understand that although no nation on earth has got it absolutely right, across the globe, there are many places where good things have been tried, where good solutions have already been identified. And we want to be able to ensure that these can be brought to people's attention. We want to ensure that there is good access to affordable housing, although of course there's a big debate about what affordability actually means. So we need an active exchange of practical experiences. We need to coordinate all of this. And the fact that this work is being managed and supported by UNECE, Housing Europe and UN Habitat, a collaboration that we've not previously worked together with, is a fantastic opportunity to have a real impact. So the background to the initiatives is that we are working with 4 key principles on the next slide. And these are environmental protection, economic effectiveness, social inclusion and participation, and cultural adequacy. A home is not something that sits in isolation to the rest of the economy and to the rest of the community. It's something that is absolutely integral to that. And to ensure that we are building and maintaining our homes well, we need to think very carefully about these 4 issues, about ensuring that we are contributing to climate change positively rather than adding to the problem, that people are properly connected. Digital inclusion is one of the big challenges that we have, and ensuring that people can live full and healthy lives. So the focus on the next slide is that we will be identifying some of the policies, tools, and really good illustrations. And this is about identifying real practices, not just coming up with new blueprints that haven't been tried, but this is properly identifying things that have worked well in the following areas: housing governance and regulation, access to finance and funding, because of course that will be critical, access and availability of land for housing construction, which is of course where everything starts. You cannot build a house unless you have a piece of land to put it on, and climate neutral housing construction and renovation. And we will be doing this through a survey where the results are being collated online and will be available on the Housing 2030 website and through the UNECE survey. And then a number of online workshops. We've already had one very effective, successful one on land in May of this year. We will have an online workshop on climate neutral housing based in Glasgow in November. Another online workshop on housing governance and regulation and what works best, particularly focusing on affordability challenges in Southeastern Europe. And that will be based in Slovenia in February. And then an online workshop based in Dublin on improving housing affordability through access to finance and funding. We will be presenting the final draft at the International Social Housing Festival in Helsinki in June of next year, and the launch of the publication at the UNECE ministerial meeting in October 2021. This is a huge program of work, but a huge opportunity to be able to improve the lives of so many of our citizens. And for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to pass over to Julie Lawson.
Thank you, Mr. Orr. We have Julie Lawson. This part of the presentation will be conducted by Ms. Julie Lawson, lead author of the Housing 2030 and Honorary Professor, Centre for Urban Research, RMIT University. Hello, Ms. Lawson.
Hello, everybody. It's very good to be with you all, and also be quite inspired to hear a minister talk so convincingly and passionately about a holistic, people-centred housing systems approach is very reassuring, if you like, that political leadership is switched on and behind this initiative. So I'm very, very pleased for Malta and enthusiastic about its future housing strategy. I'll just inform you a little bit about the tools that we'll be hoping to focus on and share and learn with each other. It's very much a can-do project, Housing 2030. So we're talking very much about tools and illustrations. The first one we focused on, as mentioned, was about land policy. So we exchanged many ideas about things like public land banking, public land leasing. Also, leasing is a very important way to influence what is developed and how houses are utilised as well. It can also keep costs down in actual housing projects and make affordability more feasible. But of course, land readjustment is something that different landholders can also cooperate and also reorganise fragmented pieces of land to make more comprehensive and potentially also more affordable and purposeful housing developments as well. So we exchanged ideas on land readjustment and also land value recapture. You might notice that, of course, land increases in value often when it's near infrastructure or when it's rezoned, when it has planning permission. But who shares in that value capture? How is it captured for the benefit of who? So capturing that value for the greater public good is also something which land policies can do and have done successfully all around the world, from Seoul to Amsterdam and Finland and many others. Of course, we also used land use planning in a fairly regulatory way in terms of zoning and planning permission. And that's also been used, for example, inclusionary zoning. We can think of Paris and in the way in which it requires affordable housing to be part of new developments, but also in the way in which neighbourhoods can plan best together. So the way in which they involve different land uses to make a more connected and diverse community. And you see agreements around those kind of objectives being institutionalised in the planning processes of Scotland. You'll hear about that today. Also in Finland and in many other countries. Good examples include, for example, Southwest False Creek in Vancouver, beautiful neighbourhood development, many diverse housing forms, from cooperatives to elderly and so on, with good bicycle and public transport connections. Moving on from land policy though, we're also going to be talking a lot about good governance. That's in the next slide here. Of course, markets don't exist on their own. There's something which is also shaped purposefully, hopefully, by good governance, by good policy guidance. And we're going to focus in our next workshop in Slovenia about all these kind of mechanisms that can be used to make multi-level agreements between governments, long-term funding transfers for programs, to have good monitoring of needs, to project those needs over time. Governance, of course, involves different types of resources, including funding. So long-term agreements about those things are very important. Also, governance needs
Miss Lawson, if you could stop for a minute, please, because we can't hear you.
have professional cater what we can doing. Okay, hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you. You may proceed. We can hear you. May proceed. Thank you.
Okay, so good governance is made of many different things. We'll have a workshop on that in Slovenia. The next slide concerns environmental sustainability. What kinds of tools will be looked at? I mean, again, financing, funding, regulation, strategic investment, subsidising and supporting the right kind of energy investments, doing research, making technical innovations. All these kinds of things are part of environmental sustainability, including tenant information and support measures and changing behaviour, as well as having competent and capable authorities involved. Finally, we're going to have a workshop in Dublin. This one will focus on funding and finance of affordable housing, something everybody wants to understand and come to grips with. We'll be looking at particular in the way in which rents are set and revenue is managed, housing allowances, how do they fit into the picture? Also the role of direct public investment, as well as shared equity, rent to buy, also around capital gains tax, the use of limited profit legislation, and so on, all kinds of measures. So I'll hand over now to my co-chair, Elena Zolnagova, and she'll be talking about where to now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. So we have now Ms. Elena Zolgayova, Housing 2030 Initiative Co-Chair. Until Ms. Elena joins, we are currently discussing, we are actually setting the stage on affordable housing, information on the Housing 2030 study objectives and the planned activities. I don't know whether Ms. Elena it seems like we cannot connect. Ms. Lawson, I don't know whether you would like to take over the presentation from Elena or whether...
Yes, it's easy for me to do that.
Thank you very much. Can you hear us, Ms. Lawson?
The main message, of course, is that housing policy and what we do with it is part of the solution to addressing affordability and also addressing the climate crisis. We know now it will also be very important in addressing the pandemic recovery. So investment in social housing in particular is one of the most effective and efficient ways to engage and recover economically, but it has many other good spin-offs for affordability and other issues. So it's important that we build the expertise and capacity in housing policy now and adapt and refine tools that are useful for us by sharing and learning from good and bad practice and having a clear direction of which we want to go through having targets and that we monitor those targets as well. So good governance also involves transparency. So when we set those targets, we need to measure how we invest in those to ensure they're actually achieved. We need to involve the community and convince them also that this is a worthy venture. So Housing 2030 tries to build capacity, and we hope to do that in a very can-do, practical and illustrative way, and look forward to people's engagement through workshops, through listening to podcasts, also to sending their best practices and having a look at the website, which is interactive and is seeking your input. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson, for Mr. David Orr and Ms. Elena Solkayova, who couldn't manage to join, but thank you so much for helping us set the stage on affordable housing. Ms. Julie Lawson will now also be moderating our first session. We will be asking how can a people-centered and systems-based approach to housing promote social cohesion, belonging and well-being. And Ms. Lawson, the floor is once again yours.
Okay. So this session, we've got something like very interesting panelists from Vienna in Austria, which is a let's start my video for everyone. So this panel involves 4 panelists. We've got Susan Bauer from the city of Vienna, Vienna Wohnen, who will talk about their initiatives in land policy. We've got Sophie Lecoq, Director of Foncier de la Ville, Paris. Very, very interesting also to talk about how they are involved in making affordable housing more possible. Javier Biron, who's also the housing manager from Barcelona, a municipality that's had to deal with mass tourism and the erosion of much affordable housing there through short-term letting platforms like Airbnb. Be very interesting to hear from Javier. And Marissa Plouin, who's from the OECD, who is involved in the affordable housing database as a housing policy analyst and has report on affordable and inclusive housing only last week or so. So I'm going to just kick off. We've got a series of questions, and the first one deals with how do we shift from a housing system which is focused on housing as an investment good and move it towards one that is more concerned about it as a home. The question therefore is, how do we move from perceiving housing just as capital to believing housing as a human and social right?
Ms. Lawson, before proceeding to the questions with the panelists, I wish to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you. So before proceeding to the questions, as Ms. Lawson informed us, we have four very interesting panelists, but we also have our keynote speaker, Ms. Rachel Marie Shikluna, Policy Development and Strategy Expert from Ministry for Social Accommodation and Chairperson of the Sustainable Communities Board Housing Authority in Malta. So, Ms. Rachel Marie Shikluna, I kindly ask you to present to us your keynote speech, and afterwards we will proceed with the panel discussion through the questions together with Ms. Julie Lawson.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Of course, it's a great honor, if not prestigious and luxurious opportunity to have this space to discuss the issues and challenges that are related to developing a housing system for the first time in Malta. So the question, how can a people-centered and system-based approach to housing promote social cohesion and well-being, was purposely chosen as when we were reflecting with the United Nations coordinating team on the role of Malta's housing system. The ultimate goal, it emerged that what we want to do is to embed equality, solidarity, and justice within the system itself. And to me, the latter are also important elements, as we've heard so far, of what makes good governance. However, I believe that the process itself of developing the system should also be central to the outcome of a realistic and successful housing system. So besides fostering, as we've heard so far today, a collaborative spirit amongst government sectors, scholars, practitioners, and citizens, which was achieved from our side and through participatory workshops back in August, I think it's important to first question the unthinkable and all that we take for granted in our daily lives. People and connectedness were in fact specifically selected as two of the main pillars, along with sustainability and digitization, as already mentioned by the Minister for Social Accommodation. In fact, we do take for granted that people and homes have endured interdependency since time immemorial. Both are inextricably linked to the built environment, which is in itself a system that is a complex network made up of social, legal, environmental, and economic facets. But also, let's not forget that homes are about our lived experiences, they're real, but they're also symbolic. That is, they are representations of our aspirations, ideals, and values. But they're also spaces, or can be spaces, of abuse, discrimination, and violence. And in fact, one of my key messages today is to put social relations at the center of the built environment for people, and that is the community, to flourish. And this takes me to my first point, which I want to put across today, and that is of understanding society. That is, what type of society are we dealing with? Of course, today I will be putting Malta as the context of this workshop discussion. And I will start by looking at the lack of a housing system in Malta, which can be indicative of who we are as a society. And I think it's worth unpacking why the government felt the need to develop a system-based approach to housing now and not later, or maybe earlier. The most obvious reason is that currently Malta has no unified or systemic housing policy, but I believe this to be a very superficial observation and deserves a broader cultural analysis of the local situation. So, Malta is a kinship-based society. Hence, most informal care, especially in later life, is still provided by female family relatives, most notably daughters, including close family as well, close friends. This suggests that the family is serving society instead of the state. This may also be a reason why we lack alternative accommodation, such as affordable housing, housing cooperatives, community-led housing, and sheltered accommodation for older people. But also, let's not forget that Malta is a nation of homeowners, as my colleague Kurt will be speaking about later on in the second session. I think another significant reason is the recent change in family legislation, as you can see from this timeline, which also attributed to new realities, possibilities, and pressures on local housing. So as you can see from this timeline, which starts from 2004 and keeps going to 2019, the household was at the core of such shifts, ending with the Private Residential Leases Act, which was the work of our own ministry, as it was a reaction to an unregulated private rented sector brought about by an economic boom, as well as these changes at the domestic level. So through this timeline, we can see how Malta, like other post-industrial countries, is experiencing a reconfiguration of the family and the domestic setting. For example, we're seeing that there's an increasing low fertility, increasing life expectancy rates, where we see that almost 20% of the Maltese population back in 2019 comprised of 65-plus residents. This also suggests that our contemporary homes cannot be understood through the dominant rhetoric of the heteronormative family, which in itself is a 20th century concept. Instead, the new form comprises, for example, of female-led single households, solo living, living apart, and blended families, including same-sex families. So with this social and legislative context in mind, it starts to become clear that there is an ill fit between the needs of the 21st century familial setting, including the 21st century dweller, domestic architectural form, and spatial planning of new housing development. And this leads me to my second point, where largely architects and planners do not always see the necessity of fit between house form, homemaking, and lifestyles. Sometimes this happens because concepts are borrowed from other cultures. So let me give you a local example. So the shrinkage of our home space, such for example, the decrease in floor-to-height ceiling, smaller balconies, lack of accessibility of the roof due to the potential of further development and high-rise, are in themselves modernist concepts borrowed from Euro-American cultures. So these modern designs go against Maltese vernacular architecture, whose form took into consideration our hot and humid climatic temperatures, but also our cultural factors, which put the social and family networks at the core of its design. So this suggests that contemporary domestic architecture is the antithesis of our kinship-based society, but also that of a society that looks outwards towards the horizon. We are an island, after all. The latter is an important observation due to urban densification, but also because of cultural habits, whereby the Maltese as a society tend to dwell within or in semi-public spaces such as the roof, balconies, and pavements. Hence, the lines of visibility from these semi-public spaces connect the dweller and their senses to the sense of spatial vastness. And this counteracts the often piecemeal infrastructure, aesthetics, and its lack of standardization, which can lead to distress and anxiety, even when simply attempting to walk to the shops. And of course, many may become prisoners of their own homes. And this raises several questions, which I cannot delve into all of them. However, I will mention questions which I think is very important, is what happens when individuals are forced to inhabit houses that are designed around another culture's concept of family life? So, moving towards the third part of my speech is how can a system be designed to speak for the social? And here I would like to share the operational side of a new policy titled Sustainable Communities Housing for Tomorrow that was developed on the above understanding. But it was also based on ethnographic research, which was conducted pre-COVID pandemic between 2018 and 2019. And the national housing system that we're currently developing was actually based on this kind of thinking and framework. And one of the research outcomes was the fact that many non-governmental organizations lacked premises where to operate from and the funds to find affordable accommodation in a cutthroat private rented sector. And this led to a new budget measure, which is funding now, which before was non-existent, specialized housing projects through the retrofitting of dilapidated and often heritage properties. And here the idea is to diversify the housing market by giving different options to different needs that people might encounter in their lives. So the operational side of its participatory approach is promoting the concept of living well, which is understood as the provision of good housing as a pathway that connects citizens through inclusive infrastructure in combination with a personalized care plan. It's also bringing together the changing households and collaborations, which to me should become as a method in themselves. And these are collaborations where they did not exist before, for example, between the government, the Chamber of Architects and Engineers, the third sector and citizen. And this is being achieved through a design competition, where not-for-profit organizations respond to a call issued by the Housing Authority. Through a briefing session, the winning organizations present their research-based projects to the architects. And this is important because this is one way of ensuring that the user groups, that is the residents, remain the protagonists of the final design. And this way of doing housing, beside addressing new domestic realities, also enable the creation of a new method in how to distribute government funds and select new services. And the aim is, of course, to create best practices by finding housing solutions through designs, but it's also promoting the idea that good housing is also about community engagement, where both residents and immediate neighbors are involved. And as you can see from the images in these slides, we have been quite active in getting involved with the community, where winning organizations of such projects have gone and spoken to the neighbors. Local councils were also involved. We also explained the proposed house plans on site to the people, and we also opened the houses. Architects were also involved in explaining the plans to the neighbors. And of course, we had NGOs explaining the spirit of the projects, and of course, this wasn't without its challenges. However, challenges, as I always say, are not always necessarily negative, because they do open up different ideas and opportunities. And now let me return back to my original question as a way of concluding my reflections. So to date, the social dimension in urban planning and housing policies is often sidelined, and the emphasis has been more on the importance of the built environment and its economic outcome, that is, the maximization of space and profit, has been put first. And less attention has been granted to social relations and the key role that they hold in determining the well-being of urban communities. So, to me, by taking the changing household as a unit of analysis and method, that is, as a fertile entry point in understanding the lives of residents, and, of course, linking this to the broader social, moral, and political contexts, then it becomes possible to remain sensitive to both the real and symbolic meaning of our homes and the built environment. So, understanding the household and home as a process also plays an important role in analyzing and designing policies that meet the needs of the locals. So, in short, what I'm trying to say is that homes have the potential to tangibly bring together structure, planning, form, cultural values, ideals and aspirations, including government policies. And finally, I contend that fluidity and change should be considered as important elements of analysis in building a resilient housing system. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel Morais-Scicluna, for giving us an overview of what have been happening in the past months and years in Malta. Thank you to Honourable Minister Caldes and to the CEO of the Housing Authority, Mr. Leonid McKay, for helping and making possible these happenings. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Now we are very happy to have with us Ms. Julie Lawson. Ms. Lawson has been inspiring us, our team in Malta, for the past month. We've been having several discussions and we have really been inspired. So we're really happy to have you with us again, Ms. Lawson, to moderate our panel discussion, where we are asking the question, how can a people-centered and systems-based approach to housing promote social cohesion, belonging, and well-being?
Yes, I think without further ado, we've got the panelists all lined up. So I think it's best we probably move straight to our first panelist, Susanna Bauer, to talk to us about how the city of Vienna, through Vienna Wohnen, is actually trying to, and has for quite a long period, been successful in guiding investment towards affordable and inclusive housing across the city of Vienna. So, Suzanne, thank you very much for being involved today, and I look forward to listening to your presentation. After your short intervention of around 5 minutes, we'll have Sophie Lecoq from Paris, Javier Buron, and later Marisa, as mentioned, each of around 5 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session based around the 4 key questions in the program. So perhaps while listening to Suzanne, keep in those and we can have a discussion via the chat soon. Okay, thank you. Suzanne.
Okay, thanks very much. I've prepared a PowerPoint. I hope we can show it. My name is Susanne Bauer. I'm working for the city of Vienna. And housing is a human right. To achieve this goal, Vienna has already started 100 years ago to build municipal and affordable housing for broad levels of society. In this tradition, Vienna has managed to build 220,000 municipal housing units and 200,000 housing units built by limited profit housing associations. They are rented in the affordable segment of the housing market for less than the market price, namely for the cost rent. Today, around 60% of the Viennese population, from about 1.9 million inhabitants, live in this segment. This is one way how Vienna works to establish housing as a human and social right. Furthermore, the Viennese city government made sure that municipal housing was not privatized. Next, please. Social and affordable housing in Vienna means that the government takes on public responsibility and offers alternatives to the free market. Accessibility is also achieved through high income thresholds. Especially in municipal housing, we make sure that special needs like overcrowding of the current flat, a priority for young persons, first movers, and single parentship are considered. Housing as a system is understood as an important instrument that within the city allows for social equilibrium and to prevent gentrification. What makes Vienna a special city are the instruments developed to implement its policy of creating a functional and social mix in all residential areas. This includes the innovative 4-pillar model, which is incorporated in the developer competitions, proving that a public housing model can successfully include competitive instruments. Thus, the numerous housing associations, most of them limited profit associations, compete for land and subsidies. Each project must be judged by an interdisciplinary jury of independent experts. This has led to the inclusion of new features in all 4 fields, with social sustainability becoming the prominent pillar besides architecture, ecology, and costs. The criteria for social sustainability include such goals as social mix, living together, that means indoor, outdoor spaces for communication and community building processes. The flexibility to cope with an increasing diverse society with varying types of households, adaptability to special needs, multi-generational living, and the integration of migrants. Next, please. The question of affordable building ground is becoming more and more important. Already in 1984, the Wohnfonds Wien, Vienna Bildungsfonds, was established. Land reserve of the Wohnfonds Wien amount to 2.7 million square meters today. Furthermore, and this is most recent, Vienna has designed effective land policies with specific zones in its land use plans, the so-called dedication of subsidized housing. When spaces are converted into residential areas, 2/3 are now earmarked for social and affordable housing.
The regulation will become effective for new dedications of 5,000 square meters and more of usable residential space. Affected are areas that are designated as a residential area or as mixed areas. Next, please. Now again, next one, please. Thank you. Having talked about the hardware, I want to point out that the software is also a very important pillar in our system. For example, urban renewal offices support local people in implementing their ideas through bottom-up processes. Networks of residents and other stakeholders are established, and everyone is invited to actively participate in neighborhood development. In addition, teams implement participation processes for both the development and redevelopment of districts. In order to make complex urban planning and decision-making process transparent, the urban renewal offices provide information at an early stage, mediate and moderate as needed, and help to find joint solutions. Furthermore, Wohnpartner aims to improve and promote the positive effects of residential diversity. This is achieved by creating spaces for social encounters between residents and by aiding them to overcome the obstacles and frictions that can arise through everyday communication and social interaction. Primarily, Wohnpartner aims to bring social housing residents together. Wiener Wohnen employs case managers. They give and organize further professional help for tenants who are threatened with evictions due to rent arrears. Their goal is to avoid homelessness and human suffering, and to ensure sustainable, high-quality living for all tenants. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present some tools of the Viennese model.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. That was very concise and practical, and of course proven in Vienna. Now move on to talk to Sophie. I can see you online, and that's terrific. And shared your screen, so I trust you're confident to move ahead.
Yes. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Start now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Sophie Lecoq from the city of Paris. We can directly switch to the next slide, please. So as you might guess, the situation of the Parisian housing market is very tense. This is due to several factors, among which the gentrification of the city, but also the fact that it is an international housing market, and more recently, the development of tourism and seasonal rentals. As you can see on these graphs, the average rent of private housing have increased by 87% since 1995, and the average price of housing when you buy a house have increased by more than 261% since 1995. So this is like very important evolution. Next, please. So the municipality of Paris has implemented a very active policy to propose solutions to modest people facing this housing crisis since 2001. This policy has focused on rental social housing, which means housing with rents far below market prices for modest people who are under revenue ceilings. And these revenue ceilings are covering 65% of the Parisian population. So it's for modest people and medium class people. Numerous tools have been implemented, mainly through the planning documents in order to develop rental social housing in new constructions, but as well as in existing buildings. So for example, we have created a social housing deficit zone with the idea of creating social mixity in different districts in Paris. And in this deficit zone, every private housing construction must include a minimum of 30% of social housing. We have also created more than 400 urban reserves, which mean places where when you make a project, you have to build social housing. We have also special tools for the planning areas, so places in Paris where we built new projects. And the rule is that in these planning areas, 50% of the land is devoted to housing, including 60% for social housing and 20% for intermediate housing. But what you must know is that half of the social housing produced in Paris is in new build operations, but the other half is in existing buildings. So how do we do this? Is that it's because the city of Paris has a very active policy of buying private buildings thanks to the right of first refusal of the Paris municipality. So this is a very important tool as well. All these different policies have been implemented thanks to a considerable financial means. It means that we invest more than 200 million subsidies every year in this policy, and it is without counting tax exemptions, land provision at reduced costs, and yeah. So this is a huge investment. Next, please. But we have, we can see the result of this policy. As you can see on this slide, the rate of social housing has increased by 8 points in 20 years. It means that now we have 21.4% of the housing in Paris, which are social rental housing. Next slide, please. But we have now to address a new growing issue in Paris, which is the middle class situation, and it is really a growing concern considering the increase of the prices. And in Paris, there had been a few social ownership programs in the 90s, which were consisting mainly in selling social housing to their inhabitants, with anti-speculative clauses prohibiting the owners to sell their apartments at market prices, but only during a limited period of time. And these kind of programs have been rapidly stopped because it finally led to private households making huge benefit thanks to public money, what we often call bargain effect, because they could sell the apartments at market prices after 5 or 10 years. But in 2014, a state law which is called Allure Law has changed drastically the situation by creating a new system which allows a dissociation between the land and the construction, I mean the building. And the public collectivity is keeping the land and selling only the construction to the people. And the construction is sold far below market prices. And it is sold to people under revenue sellings. The system is totally anti-speculative because the public collectivity keeps the land and the people only buy the buildings, and the people can resell the building to other people, but they can sell it at the same price they had bought it. It is the same price only linked to the loan evolution reference. So it's very, very anti-speculative. And we can maybe switch to the next slide, please. Thank you. Here you can see how it works on this little scheme. So first, the Solidarity Land Office acquires the land. So it is a public entity, mainly owned by the city of Paris. It acquires the land. Then a public operator builds a building on this land. And then the household can buy the buildings, and this is household under revenue sellings. The household buys the building, and then they pay a rent to the Solidarity Land Office for the occupation of the land. And then when the household wants to sell the house, they sell it at the same price they have bought it. and then it is forever available at really, really low prices for modest people. So we can go on the next slide, please. The objective of this new program is to build 1,000 housing per year of this kind. So this is really ambitious. For the beginning, we plan to mainly build these houses in planning areas. So that means new buildings. But in a second time, we plan to also do this in existing buildings, to renovate existing buildings, buy and renovate existing buildings, and develop these kind of programs also in existing constructions. How do we finance this program? The main tool is our public bank, which is called Caisse des dépôts and consignation, and which grant very, very long-term loans to the Solidarity Land Office. It is loans. It is a 80-year loans at very low rates because it's 2.4% rates. So this is basically how it works. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was very interesting. Another demonstration of the market shaping, in a sense, in the way in which together land instruments and also financing institutions can work constructively together to shape particular housing outcomes. Now going to hear from Mr. Javier Buron, who is from a housing manager from the Barcelona municipality in Spain. So without further ado, Javier, I believe you're online. And
yes, I am.
Great, and about to fire away. Thank you.
Can you hear me correctly?
Perfectly.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
But I can't see the presentation. Okay, now I see. Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation. More than happy to join. And I speak on behalf of the public housing company that belongs to the city. Next slide, please. The first approach that we have to the housing problem is that since it is a strategic problem, it needs also strategic planning. So the first thing that we did a few years ago, it was to launch a 10-year strategic housing program beyond the terms of the political mandate, because structural problems need a structural planification and also different tools. The strategic program is divided in those 4 categories of actions that you see over there. Mainly, they focus on emergency, the first one, in law enforcement, the second one, in the increase of the supply, the third one, and in the help to the demand through subsidies, grants, loans, and other type of instruments for rehabilitation and for rental. Next slide, please. Here you can see the different instruments that we are trying to use. I don't have time to go through all of them, but let me give you just a few guidelines. Our approach is to be able to mobilize 1 billion euros of investment between public and private investment, give a really big push to the social and affordable housing stock through mainly or primarily public projects, but also through a different variety of PPP projects, trying to engage with non-profits and with limited profit companies as well, and with an approach of building, buying, and also mobilizing vacant stock to social or affordable rental. The idea is diversification, use of different instruments in order to be able to cope with the objectives. Right now, we are more or less halfway to this plan and complying more or less with 50% of the objectives. Next slide, please. Speaking about subsidies, one of the particularities of the action of the city is that even though rental subsidies or allowances, they are usually financed by the state or the regional government. We have introduced these allowances also through municipal money, because we do believe that is the best way to cope with housing emergency, to be able to avoid forced evictions. Next slide, please. In the field of rehabilitation allowances, we are trying to target our policy to a certain number of social, territorial, and energy objectives in order to make the policy less universal and much more focused in the problems of the tissues of the city. And to give you a few examples, we have some anti-gentrification and anti-speculative measures through these rehabilitation subsidies or allowances. Next slide, please. As my previous colleagues, we also are working in a package of different legal provisions regarding to land reserves or inclusionary housing. The starting point is that in the Catalan legal framework, we have the obligation to devote 30% of the new developments in the expansion of the cities to affordable housing. But we didn't have any legal obligations within the existing city. And the existing city is right now the field in which all the economic interests are battling. So it's extremely important to have these inclusionary legal provisions that oblige to devote 30% of the new units within the city also to affordable housing. This is a novelty because other regions in Spain don't have these legal provisions. And there is a whole debate also about for how long the affordable housing has to remain affordable. And one of the new legal trends is that in Catalonia nowadays, the qualification of those affordable housings is forever. They cannot go back to the market, as it happens also in the Basque Country and in other regions in Spain. And now we are also introducing the legal reserves only for rental, because before that, the developer, private or public, could decide if the land that is reserved for affordable housing was for sale or for rental. Now we are introducing a 50% of the whole reserve oriented only to rental. Next slide, please. Like my colleague from Paris, the public purchasing powers are extremely important. They are being introduced in Barcelona through municipal provisions. And we have this problem of how to comply with the Catalan and the state law. But nevertheless, it's a tool that we are using more and more in the last years, because again, some of the economic and social interests that are at stake, they take place in already existing cities with not many plots of land available for the public providers in order to develop new houses. And the possibility to buy units or buildings as a whole is extremely convenient in order to look for a balance, a territorial balance of our public and PPP stocks. I will skip the next slide and I will go directly to the last one, if I may. Yes, a few conclusions. I think that we have to be aware of, or we have to try to avoid some magical thinkings. There is a tendency to, by public managers, to say that only with public housing companies we will solve the problem. Or there is a tendency of business people to say that only with market solutions everything will be perfect. There is also a tendency in town planners and also in local politicians to believe that only with fast and abundant land supply, housing prices will fall immediately and drastically. There is also a tendency by activists to believe that only with punitive measures on big corporate actors, the whole thing will be in a good shape. And also, there is some politicians that believe that only with tax breaks, the whole thing will be fixed. And I do believe that all these measures, they have to be taken into account and they have to be displayed, but there is not a silver bullet, there is not a shortcut. You have to find a mix of all these different type of instruments, and the mix, the bad news is that the mix needs money and time. And the not so obvious news is that you need also social consensus in order to be able to develop a policy in the long term. This will be it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. With that cautionary note about thank you. Now, I'm not sure if I'm sharing my. Yes, I think so. All right. We'll now move on to our final speaker for this interesting panel, Marissa Plouin from the OECD. The floor is yours. I believe you have an updated presentation. Is that right, Marissa?
That's right.
Oh, terrific. You sound loud and clear.
Excellent.
And let's move forward with your launch. Actually, all about your recently launched report. Very relevant to today. Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks again for the invitation. I may at some point turn off my video, or Zoom might decide to do that for me. It's happened a few times already this morning, but hopefully you can still see the screen. But I'm really happy to be here with you this morning and be part of this really interesting panel already. There's been a lot that's been said, I think, that has resonated with some of the work that we've been doing. What I'm going to talk about is maybe taking a bit of a step back, and looking at some of the work and the research we've been doing on issues around housing and social inclusion, around what we call inclusive growth at the OECD, and trying to tie that a little bit. We're just going to do a bit of a flyby on some of the highlights from this work that we released last week. But the idea being that I'm going to try to kind of tie that in with some of the guiding questions that have been proposed to us today, and with some of the things we've already heard about the context in Malta. So let me move along here. The report, if you want to read it, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to send you a copy of the PDF. But just to begin with, why housing matters for inclusive growth. And we've heard a lot about this already from the speaker, starting with the minister at the very beginning of the day. And the first part is that from the data that we see across countries, is that housing takes up a big and a growing share of household budgets. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, here we're measuring both across lower income households, middle income households, and upper income households. You can see housing in orange takes up the biggest share of budgets, and especially so for lower income households. This is obviously an average across around 20 countries that we have data for. And I think another thing that's quite important, and something that we know, but it's always nice to see that the data agrees, is that people are spending more on housing than they used to in their household budget. And so when we look at spending items for instance, on housing compared to health, transport, education, other items, housing has gone up a lot more than any of these other items. And that means then that people, if they're spending more on housing, they have a less of an ability to spend on other items that might help them in their, to improve their life chances, but also to improve their well-being. So that's just a first point that I wanted to kind of mention this morning. The second point in terms of why housing matters, I think one thing that has been mentioned by a few speakers already in their specific context, but we see very much across the OECD countries, so this is across 37 countries in the OECD, is that housing costs have increased since we're looking at since 2005, for instance. They've increased in about 31 out of 37 OECD countries. But it's even more stark if you look at rental costs, and rental costs have increased even more so, and in all countries except two. And so one thing that I think we're very very much looking at, and that when we talk with governments, there's a lot of concern about is the rental market, and especially the private rental market, and that we see quite a lot of vulnerability and instability among renters who tend to be low income, who tend to be youth, who tend to be some of these fragile populations already. A third piece is that housing is the main driver of wealth accumulation. So it's how households are building wealth. And that's especially true for low income and middle income households. Higher income households certainly have real estate assets, but it's also a lot of their wealth is in financial assets and other means. So I think there's this important dimension, and one thing that homeownership has always been kind of promoted as is a way for especially lower income households to build wealth. The flip side of that, I think we have to look at, and which maybe is less stressed, or at least it's been a bit more of the conversation since the crisis, is that it's also a big source of debt among low income households, and that can be okay, but it also, if it gets to be very high levels of and unsustainable levels of debt, then you have a problem both at the individual level for households, but also for the economy at large, and that's something we saw in the past decade. And the final point, and this has been well mentioned this morning, is really the broader effects that housing and the neighborhood can have on other aspects of well-being. And so there's a lot of literature and research out there that shows the effects of housing on health and vice versa, on education outcomes and opportunities, and also what was mentioned a few times on employment. And I think we have to, again, look at that both ways. It's both, a lot of my colleagues in the economics department look at the effects of different housing policies and different housing tenures on labor mobility issues, and to the extent that workers are able to, move if they need to for a better job opportunity. But we also have to look at it in the other sense, is that when you have more kind of instability in the labor market, that has implications for people's access to good quality housing, both in the rental market and also obviously in terms of accessing home ownership. So that's just a very big introduction to kind of why we think housing is so important, and some of the things we see across different countries. What we do in this particular analysis is we focus on different groups where we see they're particularly struggling or they're facing barriers in the housing market. This is not to say there are not many other groups that do, and I think in each country, in each city, you'll see very specific challenges that certainly need to be addressed. So this is not to say these are the only people or only groups that are facing trouble, but these are some that we see kind of in many country contexts. I'm not going to go into detail here, but one thing we do in the analysis is try to look at what some of these specific challenges are that they might face. Just to say, the low-income households, and I mentioned especially renters, what we see is definitely a dual housing challenge, both in terms of affordability, where they tend to be spending a lot more of their household budget on housing costs, but also in terms of quality. They tend to live in poor quality housing, and there's many ways to measure that, but what one is in terms of overcrowding, another in terms of the dwelling characteristics and how high of a quality those are. So that's something that we look at quite a bit. Youth is another big focus for a lot of countries in terms of what's happening in terms of their instability in the labor market and also in the housing market. And one thing we're seeing, and this was mentioned, I think, in the context of Malta, is that there's quite a bit of change in household composition and demographic change. And one thing among youth we've seen is that it's very different across countries, but in a lot of countries you see a lot more youth today who are living with their parents. And by youth, I'm talking about people who are between 20 and 29 years old. So in some countries, these people would be living on their own or living with roommates or partners. But increasingly, we're seeing that in some countries, they're not able to afford housing on their own. And so up to 70%, for instance, in Italy, in Greece, and the Slovak Republic, up to 70% of youth aged 20 to 29 are still living at home with their parents. So that can be a choice, but it can also be a reflection of some challenges in the housing market. I will not go into the others, but I have a lot to say about them if I could. The next point I wanted to just bring up, and this is something I think that's important to think about as well, Again, this is an average across 25 OECD countries, so it can be different depending on which country we're looking at. But one thing we have seen, if we look at data from since around 2001, is that when we think about the housing supply, which would be these green bars here, and how much governments are investing in the supply, that has been cut in half between 2001 and 2018. Governments are investing a lot less in actually building housing, whether they're doing it themselves, so that is the light green bar, share of the bar, or whether they are spending on other, other companies or actors to build the housing. Where we see kind of more a bigger share perhaps of government spending is going to be on housing allowances. So that's important. That's important demand side support for households so they can afford housing. But what this really helps us see is that governments aren't spending as much as they used to really build up the supply. And that's something that I think can help us understand just a piece of the story of why there's a shortage of affordable housing supply in many places. I'm going to conclude with some of the things we look at in terms of what can be done. And I really appreciated my predecessor here, the previous speaker, Javier, for Barcelona. There is no silver bullet from what we can see, and you really need a little bit of everything. And so what we do in this analysis is we try to break out some of the recommendations into two groups. The first being kind of what are some of these structural measures that you can take to try to level the playing field a bit more in the housing market. And so one I'm just going to mention today because it's come up a few times is a focus on the private rental market, making it more fair, more transparent, more affordable. This is something we're seeing in a lot of countries where either you have rental regulations that are a bit skewed in favor of landlords, or you have them a bit skewed in favor of tenants. And so what we're trying to see is how can we make those a bit more balanced so that it's a level playing field for everybody. Another big debate that has come up quite a bit is on rent controls and whether or not these are a good thing. Many economists say they're not, and they're really helping renters today at the expense of renters tomorrow. I think there's a bit of nuance we can look at here, and when we think about rental market regulations of what might be appropriate for a local context. But it's true that we really have to think about what are some of these medium and longer term effects and whether those are worth, I think, some of the immediate relief that we want to provide, and maybe there are better ways to do that. The second set of recommendations that we make are really looking at some of these specific barriers of the groups that I mentioned. And I'm just going to mention one here, which is something that we see in a lot of countries, and I think it was mentioned earlier today, is some of the housing support that's granted by governments doesn't necessarily reach the households that might need it most. So one thing we look at is in terms of support to try to encourage home ownership. Some of the data has shown for some countries where it sounds like a good idea to try to help first-time home buyers and try to help young people get on the homeownership ladder. But what we end up seeing from the data is it ends up helping people who could have afforded to buy a house anyways. So it's not really helping people who otherwise couldn't access housing without it. So that's something we are looking at quite a bit. Also quite a bit of work on what was mentioned earlier on social housing and the real key role that can play in providing an affordable housing solution. So I'm sorry that was so fast and really highlights of what we have talked about in the report. Just in case you're interested in any of this work on homelessness, everything that's in our database on cross-country data, we have some data on Malta in there as well. But I think I would really echo a lot of what I've heard already from my fellow panelists, and just to say that a lot of what they're talking about is what we're seeing across many countries. And so thanks again, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Marissa. That's again a very full presentation. That's a lot to take on board. And what you were trying to also emphasize was the structural solutions as well as other adjustments, if you like, but also the way in which public investment in supply has decreased while has increased in, if you like, demand assistance. Sometimes that's fruitless, of course, when prices are unregulated or when there is no rent regulation and housing allowances continue to blossom. So thank you for drawing those things to our attention. We've got a moment, just a very brief moment, because we're unfortunately over time, to dwell on the questions of that were raised about shifting the role of or shaping housing systems to better promote a people-centred approach or housing as a human right. Also to lifting the voices of vulnerable groups who perhaps are discriminated by current housing market practices, and also to fostering more resilience to booms and busts, and for cities to be able to have more resilient housing systems that strengthen social, political and economic transformation as well, so that people can remain connected to their homes and their neighbourhoods and are not vulnerable to, for example, eviction and over-indebtedness. So I'd like to see, are there any perhaps questions from people in the audience, actually?
Yes, we actually do have a question from Mr. Leonid McKay, who is the CEO for the Housing Authority in Malta. Mr. McKay, please.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I have two specific questions. One for Miss Sophie Leroy of Paris, and one for the keynote speaker, Dr. Rachel Scicluna. To Sophie, my question is, in Malta, we very much believe in promoting more home ownership, including low-income earners and social housing tenants. Can you elaborate further on your model of promoting home ownership amongst social housing tenants? You mentioned that you stopped for a while the selling of housing because of speculative purposes, so I need to know more on the model that is being used right now. And my second question to Dr. Scicluna, thanks to your keynote speech, and I'd like to ask you regarding, you mentioned a lot on community-led housing, on domestic architecture. My question, Rachel, is how can social housing, welfare housing, not only provide adequate homes for our tenants, but also can be used as a tool to promote social mobility in Malta? Thank you.
Respond from Sophie and then Rachel.
I don't know whether Sophie is currently linked.
Yes. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Sophie.
Yes, the idea is with our new system, with the Solidarity Land Office, is to have a part of this new housing that will be reserved to social housing tenants. So there will be something around 20 or 25% of this new program of housing, which will be for the social housing tenants. That's the idea. So it is different from what we were doing in the 1990s. So the inhabitants of the rental social housing cannot buy their own housing. This is not possible anymore. But they will be able to buy these new houses that we are building with this specific system of dissociation between land and construction that I was talking about. And they will have like a special access to this new housing. So like 25% of this housing will be for these people specifically. Did I answer your question or?
Has your question been answered? Yes, thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you for clarifying. And we have the second question, which was directed towards Ms. Rachel Scicluna.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very important question, actually. And I think the idea about community-led housing is that it can comprise of mixed typologies, mixed housing, so you can have affordable and private within community-led housing. And the idea behind it is that you can foster a sense of sharing and solidarity amongst residents. Like, for example, when research that I conducted back in the UK, like if people lacked, for example, cars, then they could do car sharing because they had a system inbuilt within that community-led housing. There's also the aspect that you tackle of loneliness, where people that could lead to mental health-related issues. So you can easily fall out of the property markets or out of ending up homeless because of such issues. So I think the idea of having a community-led housing can easily, first of all, you're entering affordable type of accommodation, and you can either buy or stay within renting. So the idea is to offer, I think, to diversify the housing market so that people can have choices. And I think this is what's been being said at this point. Yes, home ownership might be a way forward, but I think we need to have multiple options alongside this concept, which is a post-war concept that is of home ownership. So yes, you can enter into community-led housing, which could easily lead you towards social mobility. But what we really need is good bases where people can start from, that homes, they're not just shelters, but also enablers to push you forwards into becoming a homeowner, if that is where that is the desire, basically.
I have an interesting comment from one Sorcha Edwards, Director General from Housing Europe, and she asks the Paris speaker, who's played quite an emphasis on a new initiative, but of course in Paris there are substantial role for social housing providers in Paris already. Can you explain a little bit more about the role of those providers in shaping the Parisian housing market and how that is now and will be in the future? Sophie.
Yeah, sorry, you mean what is the role of social landlords, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard a little bit about, for example, Vienna and the scale of involvement. Perhaps you could explain a little bit more in Paris.
Yes, in Paris we have three social landlords which are in charge of building a new rental social housing and who operate all our rental social housing. So in Paris we have 250 rental social housing which are mainly operated by these social landlords. Yeah, is this the question, or sorry, I'm not sure
So what share of the Parisian housing market is actually social housing?
Yes, it's 21.4% of the Parisian housing market is operated by social landlords. So it's rental social housing. Yeah,
it's quite considerable.
Yes,
compared to Malta, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, because the Paris municipality has had a very, very dynamic policy since 2001, and we've increased a lot this social housing rate. And just to speak more about these social landlords, they will also build the housing in our new community land trust program. They will be the ones building the housing in this program as well.
So I have one final question from Anne-Lucette de Longueville, who asks, what if the Parisian OFS receives more demands than are offered? What kind of reiteration will you put in place? So
yeah, of course,
is it oversubscribed, and what will be the answer?
That is a very, very important question. we keep thinking about it, we anticipate that there will be a lot more demand than we can provide, actually. We have actually the same question for the rental social housing, because in Paris, for example, you have every year more than 200 people asking for social housing, and we can only provide for 10,000. So it's a very big difference. We anticipate that it's going to be kind of the same problem for our new program. And the idea is to implement a very transparent system of household selection. We have already that kind of system for the rental social housing. So it is totally transparent. You can know how you are selected. You have a lot of different criteria, and each criteria gives you a number of points. And with this point, you are like first or last in the list of people asking for social housing. And we are going to do the same thing for the new Community Land Trust program. So something with very clear criteria that will be transparent for all the people asking for this kind of housing.
Okay, so the governance allocation issues are important too. So thank you very much. Sophie, you attracted a lot of questions right then, but I think it's really time for a break, I'm afraid. We are rather over time. So we'll just have to thank all our participants very much and hope that they can provide their PowerPoints to be shared in some form, probably via Housing 2030 website even. But thank you very much for all your contributions and your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much thank you, Julie, for moderating this very interesting panel discussion. And thank you to all the panelists and all the questions for being part and of making this discussion possible. We will now adjourn for a 15-minute break, and we will be back with the second part of the session in 15 minutes.